I am here this afternoon with Chris Nuttall, who has been recognised under the Innovation Scheme and endorsed by his peer group. So, welcome, Chris. So perhaps you could, for our interview, introduce yourself to our audience.
Yes, so my name's Chris Nuttall. I'm a principal consultant at Atkins S&C Lavalin, and I specialise in rail timetabling and rail operations.
That's great. So how long have you worked in timetabling and operations?
So I've been in rail operations for around 10 years. Originally I was on the front line as a signaller, and I moved to consultancy around 3 years ago.
And why were you recognised under the scheme?
So I was recognised for a proposal called Retiming Railways, which is something I've been doing for many years, originally in my spare time and later on in Network Rail, and also as part of work for Atkins. It's a unique proposal to slash journey times and improve frequencies across the rail network to make it competitive with the roads. Now, you might argue that isn't that something we're doing already? We're undergoing the biggest investment in railways since the Victorian era. But actually we're not. If you look at travel habits at the moment, what you'll find is the railways are very good at taking people into central London. Almost everyone who travels to central London takes the train already. What they're not so good at is facilitating other journeys, such as non-London journeys. And if we want to make the railways competitive, those are the journeys we have to improve. Yet that's much more challenging for the railways. They're a very diverse group of markets. So what Retiming Railways is the technical solution that allows those journeys to become competitive. And it's mainly around improving interchanges, making changes much smoother. So whether your journey is on a direct train or involved in interchange, you'll be able to quickly and easily get to your destination. And by doing that, you can make the whole network competitive with the roads. And to prove this works, we worked on a proposal for Anglia, which I started in Network Rail, and that actually demonstrates that where the origin and destination are on the rail network, it's possible to get a competitive journey time with a package of upgrades and a recast timetable where the connections are optimised.
So have they actually taken this forward on Anglia then?
So the Anglia proposal started in Network Rail. It was actually Network Rail who wanted me and a colleague of mine who's now retired to look at that. It went to public consultation at the time. It had an overwhelmingly positive response, but a few people really didn't like it. So people either really liked it or really hated it, and it was a result of that Network Rail didn't take it any further, even though I said the majority of responses were very, very favourable. The next logical step is to do a business case to understand whether the costs of it are justified by the benefits, and the good news is that that's something that Atkins are supporting, and we're investigating that further.
So that's really good news then for your original proposal that you worked up then, that now somebody has seen, or Atkins has seen, the commercial viability of taking this project a bit further.
That's right, yes, and I think where Atkins and Network Rail differ is Atkins see themselves as exploring ideas and wanted to put forward ideas, whereas Network Rail was very much more politically motivated, that really it wasn't about doing the right thing, it was about not being seen to do the wrong thing.
So you're now a timetabler or operations specialist and that. Did you envisage that that's where you'd be when you were growing up?
So when I was young, I said I wanted to be someone who designed buildings, which I was told was an architect. Actually, I later went on to study civil engineering and go into civil engineering, which is actually the same thing almost in terms of somebody who designed buildings. And it wasn't until probably my teens that I started to think about going into the transport industry.
So what made you think about transport in your teens then, sort of like moving away more from the building side of things and more into transport? I
think it's a number of things. I mean, I always had an interest in railways. It was always something I was passionate about, fascinated by. But when I was young, I didn't see a career outlet. If you think back to the 80s, early 90s, railways weren't on the agenda like they are now in terms of upgrading the network. It wasn't something people talked about in those days nearly as much. So I think it's partly because of the railways moving to a more prominent position politically has made a difference. And also I just saw those opportunities that I didn't see when I was a child.
I know it's interesting, isn't it, when you think back to the 80s and particularly with privatisation, how it was a declining industry and now so many people are employed in it. So given where we've been over the last 20 years and you've developed your career, where do you see your career going in the next 20 years? Do you continue want to continue to grow within rail and transport?
So my passion is retiming Britain's railways, so it's this project obviously I've got the endorsement for, and that's something I really want to see through to its conclusion. I think the challenge for me is going to be, first of all, I hope it's something that takes off, I hope it's something that moves forward, and I say on a personal level the challenge is actually how much do I get involved in the detail or separate myself from the detail. The detail of it is actually something that really enthuses me, fascinates me, but perhaps in the long term I should start thinking more in terms of having a team doing that sort of thing, trying to encourage younger people, training up younger people to take over those sort of roles. So perhaps more moving to a role where I'm overseeing things rather than necessarily getting involved, but that's something I actually find quite difficult because I do find the detail interesting.
I think that's interesting you mentioned about mentoring younger people there, because obviously there's a skill shortage within timetable planning within rail industry and that. So what do you see your role within that, and how can you encourage people to become timetable planners?
I think I'd advise anyone who gets a job on the railways to first of all do a frontline job. I think it's really valuable. I think you see things that you can't learn in perhaps a more office-based environment. And I think the other thing is just strive for technical excellence. And I think it's that's the most important grounding, I think, for anyone getting involved.
Because you've worked in the signal box at
That's
Victoria,
right, yes,
haven't you?
Signal, yeah. Yes.
So do you think that's been invaluable to you, being able to understand the timetable
Absolutely.
and how it works?
I think in terms of sort of further education, I couldn't have done a further education course that would have taught me those things.
So we've talked a bit about mentoring, but who's inspired you? Who've been your role models?
So role models are a funny thing. I suppose I'm going to be slightly cliched and say Nelson Mandela is a good role model for people in the railways. The reason is, when I was working at Network Rail, a lot of people in the strategic planning department couldn't see beyond the short term, beyond the next franchise, beyond the next control period. And I think people should make judgments about what they do, their decisions, based on whether they think an idea is worthwhile, whether it's worth doing. It doesn't matter if at the moment it doesn't look likely to happen. It doesn't matter if you're 80 before it does happen. It's still worth doing and is worth devoting your life to.
That's a really inspiring message to say that it's worth dedicating your life. The politics of the railway make that very difficult to do that, don't they? They
do, and I think it comes down to individuals having that passion, having that faith. It's about faith in faith and belief in an idea that may not even happen in your lifetime, but it doesn't matter.
So if you were giving advice to senior leaders to strive for that vision, what would you tell them that they needed to do?
This is interesting because working in a frontline job, you probably have a very different perspective of leaders than perhaps you do in certain other roles when you're more involved in the strategy of the railways. And I think, again, it goes back to the concept of technical excellence. If you strive for something and achieve it and it physically works, people respect that, and that inspires the workforce and inspires people. If you come up with a gimmick that gets abandoned after a couple of years, people get demoralised and people won't listen to you. And I think it's that technical excellence, doing things that actually work. I think that's really, really important.
That's a really good message, because I think probably when you look to other industries, if you're thinking of other engineering companies, they do strive for that technical excellence. So who do you think we could learn lessons most from in other industries? So
I don't even think we need to look outside of transport. I think the biggest challenge I found in Network Rail was the perception that the railways and the rail industry should do as it's told. It should sit within the regulatory framework imposed on it by government and follow that, even if that means it can't achieve its potential, it can't deliver the best for its customers, and it can't deliver its own financial success. And I think other industries are very much better at lobbying government about what is the best framework they should operate in to deliver those things. If the 1993 Railways Act prevents the trains running on time, then the rail industry should be saying this. It shouldn't just be following.
Do you think that's a simple justification then for just stopping the railway from moving forward and actually improving it for the customer?
I think there's a lot of really complex issues and big challenges the railway face. I don't think it's just one thing, but I think that's something I see as a pattern. It's the lack of seeing it as your place to challenge the framework within you, which you exist and operate.
Do you think that's because it's so authoritarian, and that because we're still very hierarchical as an industry?
I think there's a number of things. I think a lot of decisions in the railways since privatisation have been put in the hands of the civil service. Now the civil service can't lobby government, is not in that position. It physically is not in a position it can do that. Network Rail, I would say, is a little bit more detached from government and probably is in a position where it could take on that role a little bit more. But I think it's partly because a lot of the decision making is so close to government. It's very difficult to say actually what's technically best for the railways goes against what your policy is.
So do you feel positive about the current rail review then?
I keep an open mind because actually I'm really intrigued to see what will happen.
So I think I probably know this answer, but I'm going to ask it anyway. But what problem would you really like to solve within the rail industry?
I want to see the railways competitive with the roads. I want to see the train and public transport as a whole providing a viable alternative to driving, and at the moment I don't feel it does that.
And why do you not think that does that at the moment?
Rail has a relatively low market share, and it actually goes back to often my personal decision making about the transport choices I make. I don't always take the train. I sometimes drive, and I know the reasons I do that, and it's very much down, not because I don't like trains. I really like travelling by train, but there are barriers at the moment that encourage me not to sometimes, and I want to see those overcome.
So I'm going to give you £100 million. What are you going to spend it on?
I would spend it on a long-term plan for the railways. At the moment, we don't know what train service we want to run in 20 years' time. Countries like Switzerland and Austria do know, and I think that's what we're lacking, and that's what I'd spend it on.
And that comes down to those short-term 5-year plans again, doesn't it?
That's right, and even those 5-year plans, we don't know what timetable we're going to operate in 5 years, because actually the way capacity is allocated on the network doesn't allow us to come up with a timetable, i.e. the train service we want to run, and then implement it.
Mega projects or incremental upgrades?
I think we focus too much on inputs when we think of rail upgrades and not enough on outputs. The questions we should be asking are, do we want all north-south journeys in the country to be competitive, rail to be competitive against air? Do we want rail to be competitive against road? What do we want our rail market share to be in 10 years? And when you start deciding on those outputs, actually the questions about mega projects and incremental upgrades actually answer themselves.
Great answer. More seats or more bikes?
So I would say purely from a financial perspective of the railways, I would say more bike space. And the reason is the railways have a problem that they're oversubscribed at peak times and underutilised at off-peak times. And financially this is a really big problem for the railways. Every peak passenger you encourage onto the railways exacerbates that problem. Every off-peak passenger you encourage helps alleviate that problem. And because I feel the bike spaces, things like seat comfort, to come in the same category, I think it's really important from the financial perspective of the railways to encourage those off-peak passengers, because actually that's what gives us our financial base.
And would make it more profitable for the railway as well,
in
because
my belief,
we wouldn't
yes.
be moving fresh air around all day.
That's right, and every time the peak market is elastic. If you don't provide the service they want, they'll go somewhere else, they'll drive, they'll not make the journey. The peak market is actually relatively inelastic. Not that I want them to make things unpleasant for people travelling at peak times, but for the financial good of the railways, I would go for more bike space.
Basic economics. Air conditioning or heating?
I'm not a big fan of air conditioning. I prefer to open a window, so I do quite like to sit by a fire in winter, so I'll go for heating.
And tell us a fun fact.
So it depends what you call fun. I think an interesting fact that's often overlooked is if you look back over the last 40 years, the number of people travelling into central London has hardly changed.
Has it not?
No.
Why is that?
It's a fairly static market.
So
it's not a growth market.
All the growth has come from outside of London?
Either off-peak travel into London or journeys not into central London, such as London Overground. That's been a huge area of growth, which is not about taking people to central London, it's about other movements within London.
Well, not fun, but certainly interesting. Thank you very much. I hope you found it as enjoyable as I did.
It's been a pleasure.
Thank you.